April 15th, 1945, 6:47 in the morning. The barbed wire sang in the wind, not the shrill whistle of air raid sirens, not the thunder of artillery that had shaken the Rhine Valley for months, just wire, humming its low metallic note against a gray sky that promised nothing. Behind that wire, 340 women waited. They stood in rows that weren't quite straight, wearing clothes that weren't quite clothes anymore. Fabric worn so thin it was more memory than material. Shoes held together with string and hope, faces that had forgotten what it meant to be full. Marlene Fisher stood near the back. 28 years old, though hunger had carved decades into her cheekbones. Her blonde hair, once carefully pinned in the style demanded by the Reich, now hung in dull strands around her shoulders. Her blue eyes, sharp as winter ice, tracked every movement in the compound with the wariness of a cornered animal. She had learned to trust nothing, not the other women, not the guards, certainly not the Americans in their crisp khaki uniforms who had taken over the camp 3 weeks ago. Trust was a luxury like butter or white bread or the belief that tomorrow might be different from today. The sound came first, metal on metal, not the clang of a rifle bolt or the scrape of a gate lock. Something softer, almost musical. The ring of a ladle striking the rim of a pot. Then the smell. Marlene's body responded before her mind could catch up. Her stomach clenched. Saliva flooded her mouth so suddenly she had to swallow hard. Coffee. Real coffee, not the bitter brown water made from roasted acorns that had passed for coffee in Germany for the past 3 years. The scent drifted across the compound like a ghost of the world before the war, before the bombs, before the hunger that had become as constant as breathing. Butter. Warm bread. The women began to move. Not running. They had learned that running brought punishment. But walking quickly, forming a line that snaked across the muddy ground toward the makeshift kitchen where American soldiers stood behind a long table. Marlene stayed where she was. Let the desperate ones go first. Let them discover whatever trick this was, whatever new humiliation the conquerors had devised. She had worked in the propaganda ministry in Munich. She knew how enemies operated. Food was a weapon, same as bullets. You just died slower. But her feet betrayed her. Step by step, she found herself joining the line. In front of her stood Lotte Schneider, 19 years old, a farmer's daughter from the Black Forest with hands that were still calloused from working fields that no longer belonged to her family. The Americans had taken everything when they came through. The land, the house, the last bag of seed grain her mother had hidden in the barn. Lotte's hands shook as she clutched a tin plate. She had thin wrists, bird bones, the kind of frame that showed every rib, even through clothes. Her brown hair hung limp against her neck. Her eyes were too large for her face, now made huge by the hollowing of her cheeks. She turned and looked at Marlene. No words, just a glance that said everything. Are we really going to eat? Is this real? Should we trust this? Marlene's face gave nothing back. She had learned that too. Show nothing, want nothing, survive. The line moved forward. At the serving table, American soldiers worked with practiced efficiency. Young men, most of them, though the war had aged them the same way it aged everyone. Their uniforms were clean, their faces shaved. They moved like people who had never known real hunger, scooping food from huge pots with the casual indifference of routine. One of them stood out, taller than the rest, with dark hair, cut military short, and eyes the color of wet earth. His name tag read Walsh. Sergeant Frank Walsh, from somewhere in America that Marlene had never heard of and would never see. He didn't smile as he worked, didn't frown either, just ladled food onto plates with the mechanical rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times before and would do it 1,000 times more. Lotte reached the front of the line. She held out her plate with trembling hands. Frank Walsh looked at her for a moment, not with pity, not with contempt, just looked. Then he dipped the ladle into a pot and scooped out a portion of scrambled eggs. Powdered eggs reconstituted with water, but eggs nonetheless, yellow and steaming. He added a slice of white bread, spread butter across it, real butter, thick and glistening, poured coffee into a tin cup, handed it all to Lotte. The girl stood frozen, staring at the plate like it might disappear. Move along, another soldier said. Not unkindly, just practical. There were 300 more women waiting. Lotte stumbled to the side, found a place on a bench, and sat down. She lifted the bread to her face, inhaled, And then she began to cry. Silent tears that ran down her cheeks as she took the first bite, chewing slowly, reverently, like she was eating something holy. Marlene watched, felt something twist in her chest, something that might have been anger, or might have been envy, or might have been the simple, terrible recognition that her body was betraying her. That despite everything she believed, everything she had been taught, she wanted that bread more than she wanted her pride. Her turn came. She stepped forward and held out her plate, kept her eyes down, refused to look at the American sergeant's face. Frank Walsh didn't speak, just served. Eggs, bread, butter, coffee. Marlene took the plate. Her hands shook despite every effort to steady them. The weight of the food felt impossible. When had she last held something this heavy? When had a plate ever been full? She found a space apart from the others, set the plate down on her knees, looked at it. White bread. She remembered white bread. Before the war, her mother used to buy it from the bakery on Kaufingerstrasse every Sunday morning, warm from the oven, the crust crackling as you tore it. But that was another life, another Marlene who had worn clean dresses and worried about things that seemed laughable now. For the past 3 years, bread had been gray, mixed with sawdust or potato flour or whatever the bakers could find to stretch the grain. It tasted like cardboard and sat in your stomach like a stone. But you ate it because it was food, and food meant one more day of being alive. This bread was white, pure white, soft. Marlene picked it up. The butter had melted into the surface, making it glisten. She pressed it to her face, inhaled. The smell hit her like a physical thing, rich, sweet, impossibly real. She took a bite. The taste flooded her mouth, salt and yeast and butter. The softness of it, the way it dissolved on her tongue instead of requiring the kind of determined chewing that gray bread demanded. She swallowed, felt it go down, warm and substantial and so good it hurt. Her eyes burned. No, she would not cry, would not give them the satisfaction. But the tears came anyway, hot and unwelcome, spilling down her cheeks as she sat on that bench in the prison camp, holding bread given to her by her enemy, tasting something she thought she would never taste again. This is the best food I have ever had. The thought came in German. Das beste Essen meines Lebens. She said it out loud without meaning to. A whisper, a confession. Across the yard, Frank Walsh heard the words but didn't understand them. He saw the woman crying, though. The blonde one with the hard eyes who had refused to look at him when he served her. He saw her shoulders shake, saw her take another bite of bread like she was afraid someone would steal it. He had seen this before. Saw it every morning when they distributed rations. The shock, the disbelief, the way starving people approach food with the kind of reverence most people reserve for religious ceremonies. They treat it like caviar, one of the other soldiers had joked yesterday. We're giving them spam and they act like it's Christmas dinner. But Frank didn't find it funny. He had grown up on a farm in Iowa during the Dust Bowl, had watched his mother cry exactly once in his entire childhood, and it was the day they ran out of flour and she couldn't make bread for Sunday dinner. He remembered that, remembered the sound of her crying in the kitchen while his father sat at the table with his head in his hands. Hungry people don't need politics, his father had said later. They need food. Frank had been 12 years old. He hadn't understood then. But he understood now, watching these women eat American rations like each bite might be their last. The line continued, woman after woman, each one receiving the same portion. Eggs, bread, coffee. The sounds filled the compound, spoons scraping against tin plates, the soft murmur of voices, the occasional sob. By 7:30, everyone had been served. The soldiers began cleaning up, stacking the empty pots, wiping down the serving table. Another morning, another meal, another day in occupied Germany. Frank pulled a small notebook from his pocket. He kept a diary, though he wasn't supposed to. The officers frowned on it. Security, they said, but Frank wrote anyway. Short entries, observations. April 15th, 1945. They licked the plates clean. I've never seen people so grateful for spam. He paused, added one more line. Makes you wonder what they've been eating. He closed the notebook, looked out across the compound. The women were dispersing now, returning to their barracks. Some walked alone, others in small groups talking quietly. A few still sat on the benches, holding their empty plates, staring at nothing. Marlene Fisher was one of them. She sat perfectly still, her plate on her knees, her hands folded in her lap. Her face was dry now. Whatever tears had come were gone. But something had shifted in her expression. A crack in the armor. She looked down at her plate, at the smear of butter still visible on the tin, at the few crumbs of bread she had missed. She wet her finger, pressed it against the crumbs, brought them to her mouth. Nothing wasted, not a single speck. Then she stood, walked to the washing station, rinsed her plate in the cold water, dried it with a rag, placed it carefully on the stack with the others. She turned and caught Frank Walsh looking at her. For a moment their eyes met. Two people on opposite sides of the wire, victor and vanquished, American and German, man and woman. He nodded once, a small gesture, acknowledgement without judgment. Marlene's jaw tightened. She looked away, walked back toward the barracks without a word. But that night, lying on her thin mattress in the dark, listening to the breathing of 60 other women in the crowded room, Marlene reached into the pocket of her coat, felt the small piece of bread she had hidden there. A single bite-sized piece. Saved. Hidden. Kept. She didn't know why she had taken it. Didn't know what she planned to do with it. Evidence, maybe. Proof that this had happened. That the Americans had fed them. That the world had turned so completely upside down that kindness could come from the hands of enemies. She pulled the bread out, held it close to her face in the darkness, smelled it, closed her eyes. Tomorrow they would come again. The soldiers, the pots, the ladles ringing against metal. Tomorrow there would be more food. She knew this now. Could feel the certainty of it settling into her bones. And that certainty terrified her more than hunger ever had. Because hunger, she understood. Hunger was simple. It had a logic, an endpoint. You starved or you didn't. You survived or you died. But this being fed by the enemy, being given food you didn't earn, didn't deserve, couldn't repay. What was the price of this bread? What would they demand in return? Marlene squeezed the bread in her fist, felt it compress, felt the butter smear against her palm. She had worked for Joseph Goebbels, had typed memoranda about the Americans, had formatted propaganda posters that showed American soldiers as brutes, monsters who would rape German women and burn German cities and grind the German people into dust. She had believed it, or had told herself she believed it, had done her can and collected her pay and gone home each night to her small apartment in Munich and tried not to think about what the words she typed actually meant. But now she had tasted American bread, had seen American soldiers serve food instead of bullets, had cried in front of them and they had not laughed. What did that make her? A traitor to the Reich? A fool who had believed lies? Or just a woman who had survived one more day in a world that had stopped making sense? She didn't know, didn't have an answer. So she did what she had learned to do in the 3 years since her husband died at Stalingrad. She pushed the questions down, buried them, survived. She put the bread back in her pocket, rolled onto her side, closed her eyes, and tried not to think about tomorrow morning, about the sound of the ladle, about the smell of butter, about the way Frank Walsh had looked at her. Not with hatred, not with pity, just looked, like she was a person. Not a German, not a prisoner, just a person. That was the worst part, the part she couldn't forgive, because it was easier when they were monsters, easier when the world was simple. Us and them, good and evil, victory or death. But bread complicated everything. Butter made you doubt, coffee made you question whether the enemy was really the enemy at all. Marlene pulled her thin blanket up to her chin. The barracks were cold. They were always cold, but her stomach was full, for the first time in months truly full. And in the darkness, despite herself, despite everything, she felt the smallest, most dangerous thing a prisoner could feel: hope. Across the compound in the guards' quarters, Frank Walsh sat at a small table writing a letter home. He wrote to his sister every week, told her about the weather, about the other soldiers, about anything except the things that actually mattered. Tonight was different. Dear Ellen, he wrote, I did something strange today. I fed 300 German women breakfast. Good breakfast, too. Better than what some folks back home are probably eating. And you know what the strangest part was? They cried. Grown women crying over eggs and bread. Makes you realize how different our worlds are, how lucky we've been. I keep thinking about what Dad said during the Dust Bowl, about hungry people, about how hunger doesn't care about politics. I think I finally understand what he meant. He paused, stared at the page, added one more line. I don't know if what we're doing here is right or wrong, but I know those women needed to eat, and we had food, so we fed them. Maybe that's all there is to it. He signed the letter, folded it, placed it in an envelope. Outside, the wind picked up. The barbed wire sang its endless song, and somewhere in the darkness, 340 women slept with full stomachs for the first time in longer than most of them could remember. The war was almost over, but for the women behind the wire and for the men who guarded them, the real battle was just beginning. The battle against everything they had been taught to believe. The battle against hate and fear, and the simple, terrible human capacity for seeing enemies instead of people. Tomorrow morning at 6:30, the ladles would ring again, the pots would steam, the smell of coffee would drift across the compound, and 340 women would line up for breakfast served by the hands of their conquerors. And with each meal, with each bite of bread, with each cup of coffee, the wire between them would become a little less like a barrier and a little more like a line drawn in sand. Arbitrary, temporary, meaningless in the face of the one thing that connected them all, the simple human need to survive one more day, to taste butter one more time, to believe that somewhere beyond the ruins and the hatred and the endless grinding violence of war, there might still be a world worth living in, a world where enemies could become something else, something more complicated, something almost like human beings. But that transformation would take time, would take more than one breakfast, more than a week or a month or even a year. It would take a miracle measured in ladles and coffee and the slow, painful work of learning to see past the uniform to the person underneath. And it would start here, in this camp, on this cold April morning, with the smell of butter drifting through the wire and the sound of women crying as they tasted food they never thought they would taste again, the best meal of their lives, given to them by the people they had been taught to hate most in all the world. April 16th, 6:30 in the morning. The sound came before the light, metal striking metal in a rhythm that had already become familiar. One day, just one day of breakfast, and already Marlene's body knew the sound, knew what it meant. Food. She opened her eyes in the gray darkness of the barracks. Around her, 60 women stirred on their mattresses. Some sat up immediately. Others lay still, perhaps wondering if yesterday had been a dream, a hallucination born of hunger and desperation. But the sound continued, the ring of the ladle, the clank of pots being set on tables, and then drifting through the cracks in the wooden walls that smell again. Coffee. Marlene's stomach twisted. Not with hunger this time, with something worse. Anticipation. Her body had remembered what it felt like to be oil, and now it wanted more, demanded more. The animal part of her that didn't care about pride or politics or the fact that accepting food from the Americans meant accepting defeat. She sat up, pulled on her worn coat, ran her fingers through her hair without bothering to look for a mirror. Vanity was another luxury from another life. The women filed out into the cold morning air. No one spoke. They had learned silence in this place. Words were dangerous. Words revealed too much. Better to move like ghosts through the routine of captivity. But this morning was different. This morning there was a line forming even before the soldiers had finished setting up. Women standing in the mud breath, visible in the April chill, waiting. Marlene joined them, found herself standing closer to the front than yesterday. Not pushing, not rushing, but not hanging back either. Lotta Schneider was already there, third in line. The farm girl who had cried over bread yesterday now stood with her shoulders a little straighter, her eyes a little brighter. One meal had done that. One full stomach had reminded her body what it felt like to have strength. The serving began. Frank Walsh and his soldiers moved through the same routine. Eggs, bread, coffee. The mechanical efficiency of men who had done this so many times it had become muscle memory. But today, Marlene watched differently, paid attention to details she had missed yesterday in her shock and hunger. The portions were exactly the same for every woman. The sergeant measured each scoop carefully. No favoritism, No punishment, just food distributed with mathematical precision. The bread was fresh. Someone had baked it this morning. She could tell by the warmth of it the way steam rose when it was cut. The soldiers themselves ate from the same pots. She saw one of them, a young private with red hair and freckles, take a piece of cornbread and make a face, saw him mutter something to the man next to him, saw them both laugh. They were complaining about the food. These Americans who had more food than they knew what to do with were actually complaining about it. Marlene felt something hot and sharp rise in her throat. Anger. These men who had never known real hunger, who threw away bread because they were tired of eating it, who grumbled about Spam like it was poison instead of protein. But then her turn came and Frank Walsh was holding out a plate, and the anger dissolved in the face of immediate need. She took the food, walked to a bench, ate. The bread tasted just as good as yesterday, the butter just as rich. But this time there were no tears. This time her body simply accepted the food as fact, as something that was happening, as reality. When she finished, she didn't rush to wash her plate. She sat, watched the other women eat, watched the soldiers clean up, watched the morning sun break through the clouds and paint everything in shades of gold and gray. This was day 2, and already it felt like routine. The pattern continued. Day 3, day 4, a week, 2 weeks. April 20th. Lotta Schneider stood in line holding her tin plate when Private James Mitchell handed her something extra. A small rectangular package wrapped in brown paper and foil. Lotta stared at it. Didn't understand, Chocolate James said. He was 20 years old, from Ohio, had a gap between his front teeth that showed when he smiled. Go on, take it. Lotte looked at the package like it might explode. She hadn't seen chocolate in 4 years. Not since 1941, before the rations got really bad. Before the war ate everything. She took it, held it against her chest, walked away from the line in a daze. Marlene saw it happen, saw the American private slip the candy to the farm girl, saw Lotte's face transform from confusion to something that looked almost like joy. That evening in the barracks, Lotte unwrapped the chocolate with trembling fingers. The other women gathered around, 60 pairs of eyes watching as the foil peeled back to reveal brown squares stamped with letters. Hershey's. Lotte broke off a piece, put it in her mouth, closed her eyes. The taste hit her like a memory. Sweetness, pure, uncomplicated sweetness. The chocolate melted on her tongue, and for just a moment she was 12 years old again, standing in her father's kitchen in the Black Forest, eating chocolate her uncle had brought back from Switzerland. She broke off another piece, held it out to Marlene. Here, she said, share it with me. Marlene looked at the chocolate, looked at Lotte's open, trusting face, felt something cold settle in her chest. No, Marlene said. I don't take gifts from the enemy. Lotte's hand dropped. But why not? They gave it freely. Freely, Marlene repeated. The word tasted bitter. Nothing is free. Everything has a price. They want something from us. What could they possibly want? Lotte asked. We have nothing. We were prisoners. Exactly, Marlene said. We're prisoners, and they're the ones who put us here. Don't forget that. But Lotte was already eating another piece, and the other women were asking for a taste, and Marlene turned away, lay down on her mattress, stared at the ceiling. That night she couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about the chocolate, about the way Lotte had offered to share, about the casual generosity of the American private who had given away something valuable like it meant nothing. Marlene's stomach growled despite the bread and eggs she had eaten that morning. Not with hunger, with want. She wanted that chocolate, wanted the sweetness of it, wanted to taste something other than bread and eggs and the bitter coffee that was still better than anything she had tasted in years. But wanting it meant admitting something, meant admitting that the Americans had something she desired, that they had power over her in ways that went beyond the barbed wire and the guards and the rules of captivity. She rolled onto her side, pulled her thin blanket up, tried to sleep. But in the darkness, she could hear Lotte humming softly to herself, a happy sound, the sound of a girl who had been given chocolate by a boy who smiled at her. And Marlene realized with a jolt that what she felt wasn't just anger or pride or political conviction. It was jealousy. She was jealous of a 19-year-old farm girl who had been given a chocolate bar by an enemy soldier. The realization made her feel sick. April 25th, 10 days since that first breakfast. Frank Walsh stood at the serving table scooping eggs onto plates when Marlene Fisher approached. He had learned to recognize her over the past week and a half. The blonde woman with the hard eyes who never smiled, who took her food without looking at him, who ate alone. This morning was different. This morning she looked at him, met his eyes directly. He nodded, a small acknowledgement, prepared to serve her the usual portion. Then to his surprise she spoke. One word in heavily accented English. Janog. Frank blinked. It took him a moment to process. She was asking if he had enough. If there was enough food. No. Wait, she was speaking German, asking him if he understood. He set down the ladle, switched to the broken German his grandfather had taught him as a child. Barely functional, grammar probably terrible, but German nonetheless. Ja, he said. Ein bisschen, a little. Marlene's eyes widened. Just a fraction, just enough to show that she hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected an American soldier to speak her language. She said something else. Too fast, too complicated. Frank caught maybe one word in three. He held up his hand. Langsam bitte, slowly please. Marlene took a breath, simplified. Warum, why? The question hung between them. Why are you feeding us? Why are you being kind? Why aren't you treating us like enemies? Frank considered his answer, thought about how to say it in German, gave up, switched back to English. Orders, he said, Geneva Convention. We have to feed prisoners same as our own soldiers. Marlene understood enough English to catch the meaning. Her jaw tightened. So it's just rules, just following orders. Frank shook his head. No, not just that. Then what? He met her eyes, saw the hardness there, saw the fear underneath it, saw a woman who had built walls so high and thick that kindness couldn't penetrate. We could starve you, he said slowly, carefully. We could give you half portions, quarter portions, could make you weak, could make you suffer. Nobody back home would know, nobody would care. Marlene said nothing, waiting. But we don't, Frank continued, because you're hungry and we have food and hungry people need to eat. That's all? That's all, Marlene repeated. Her voice was flat, disbelieving. Yeah, Frank said. That's all. He picked up the ladle again, served her portion, eggs, bread, butter, coffee, the same as every other woman in the camp, the same as every day. Marlene took the plate, stood there for a moment longer, looking at him like she was trying to solve a puzzle that had no solution. Then she walked away. But Frank noticed she didn't go to her usual spot on the far bench. She sat closer today, where she could see the serving line, where she could watch. That afternoon, mail call came. The Red Cross had arranged for limited correspondence. Prisoners could receive letters from family members outside the camp, 1 letter per month, censored, inspected, but still. Contact with the world beyond the wire. Lotte Schneider's name was called. She stepped forward, took the envelope with shaking hands. It was from her mother, written on paper so thin it was nearly transparent, the handwriting shaky, the ink smudged in places where water had touched it, or tears. Lotte read it standing in the middle of the compound. Read it once, then again, then a third time. Then she sat down on the ground and put her head in her hands. Marlene approached slowly, stood over the girl. What does it say? Lotte looked up. Her eyes were red. She's starving. My mother, the whole village. They're eating grass, tree bark. She asked if I'm eating, if the prison feeds us. Marlene said nothing, just looked at the letter in Lotte's hands, at the desperate scrawl of a mother trying to check on her daughter while slowly dying of hunger herself. She asked if it's better in here than out there, Lotte whispered. If I'm lucky to be a prisoner. The irony was so sharp it cut, the paradox so complete it couldn't be argued with. Outside, the wire-free German citizens were starving. Inside, the wire German prisoners were eating 3 meals a day provided by their conquerors. Marlene's name was called next. She had a letter too, from her younger sister in Munich. She opened it, read. The words were similar to Lotte's. Hunger, desperation, cold. The city was in ruins. The ration cards were worthless. People were trading jewelry for potatoes, fighting over scraps in the street. Her sister wrote, Are you safe? Are they treating you well? I pray you have enough to eat. Marlene folded the letter carefully, put it in her pocket, walked back to the barracks without a word. That night, she lay in the darkness thinking about her sister, about Munich, about the apartment they had shared before Marlene was arrested for hoarding food rations, before she became a prisoner instead of a citizen. She reached into her coat pocket, felt the piece of bread she had saved from breakfast. She had been saving a piece every day, hiding it, accumulating. For what, she wasn't sure. Maybe as evidence. Maybe as insurance against the day the Americans stopped feeding them. Maybe just because the act of saving food was the only control she had left. But now, holding that bread in the dark, she thought about her sister, about sending it to her, about somehow getting this food to the people outside who needed it more. The absurdity of it struck her. She was a prisoner planning to send food to free citizens. The world had inverted completely. She put the bread back, closed her eyes. Across the room, Lotte was crying softly into her pillow, crying for her mother, for her village, for the impossible choice between guilt and gratitude. May 3rd. 2.5 weeks of routine. Frank Walsh noticed Marlene Fisher had started arriving at the food line earlier each day. Not first, never first, but earlier. And she had stopped eating alone. She sat near Lotte now, near some of the other women, not talking much, but present. He also noticed something else. The way her coat pocket always bulged slightly. The way she sometimes touched it like checking to make sure something was still there. He knew what she was doing, saving food, probably planning to smuggle it out somehow, to family or friends. The regulations said he should report it, said he should confiscate any hoarded food, said prisoners weren't allowed to save rations. But Frank pretended not to notice, just kept serving, kept the line moving, kept the portions exactly the same. One morning when Marlene came through the line, he gave her an extra slice of bread. Didn't say anything, didn't make a show of it, just placed it on her plate and moved to the next person. Marlene stared at the extra bread, looked up at Frank. Her eyes asked the question she couldn't voice. Why Frank didn't answer, just nodded toward her pocket, toward the bulge where he knew she kept her hidden food. For your sister, he said quietly in English. Marlene's face went white. He knew. He had known all along. She opened her mouth, closed it, took the plate with both hands so it wouldn't shake. Thank you, she said. The words came out like they were being pulled from somewhere deep, like they hurt. Frank had already moved on to the next woman. But he had heard her, those 2 words, the first civil words she had ever spoken to him. That evening, Frank sat in his quarters writing in his journal. The small notebook was nearly full now, weeks of observations, thoughts he couldn't say out loud. May 3rd, 1945. She said thank you today. The blonde one with the hard eyes. First time she's acknowledged me as anything other than the enemy. She's been saving bread. I think for family outside, I gave her extra. Orders would say I shouldn't. But orders don't know what it's like to watch someone starve. To have food and power and watch someone else have nothing. He paused, added another line. Maybe that's what winning really means. Having so much you can afford to give some away. Having power and choosing not to use it. May 8th, 1945. The news came at dawn, spread through the camp like electricity through wire. Officers shouting, soldiers running. An energy that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with release. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. Unconditional, total, complete. In the women's barracks, the reaction was different. Silence first, then whispers, then the slow, terrible understanding that everything was finished. The Reich, the dream, the 1,000-year empire that had lasted barely 12. Lotte Schneider sat on her mattress shaking, not from cold, from fear. They'll kill us now, she whispered. Now that the war's over, they'll punish us. They'll take revenge. Marlene sat beside her, put a hand on the girl's shoulder. Said nothing because there was nothing to say. No assurance she could give. No promise that would be worth anything. They waited. All 340 women waited through the long morning for whatever would come next. At 6:30, a sound cut through the silence, the ring of a ladle against a pot. Marlene stood, walked to the window, looked out. The soldiers were setting up breakfast. Same as every day, same pots, same tables, same routine. Frank Walsh stood at his usual position, ladling eggs, cutting bread, pouring coffee. The war was over. His war was over. He could go home now, could leave this place and these people and never think about them again. But he was still serving breakfast. Marlene watched him for a long moment, watched the other soldiers joke with each other, watched them work with the same mechanical efficiency as always. Then she turned to Lotta. "Come on," she said. "It's time to eat." Lotta looked at her, disbelieving. They're still feeding us, apparently. But why Marlene didn't have an answer. So she just walked toward the door. And after a moment, Lotta followed. The line formed, slower than usual, more hesitant. Women emerging from the barracks like they expected a trap. Expected this to be the moment when kindness turned to cruelty. But the soldiers just served. Same portions, same food, same routine. When Marlene reached the front of the line, Frank Walsh looked at her. Really looked. His eyes were tired. He had been up all night celebrating the end of the war with the other soldiers. She could see it in his face. But he was here anyway, serving breakfast to German prisoners on the day of Germany's defeat. "Congratulations," Marlene said in English. "The war is over. You won." Frank nodded, picked up the ladle. "Yeah, we won." He served her portion, started to move to the next woman, then stopped, looked back at Marlene. "The war's over," he said. "But you still need to eat. That hasn't changed." Marlene took her plate, felt the weight of it, the warmth. "No," she said quietly. "That hasn't changed." She walked to her usual bench, sat down, looked at the food. White bread, butter, eggs, coffee. The best meal of her life. Given to her by the enemy on the day of their greatest triumph. Given without gloating, without conditions, without demands. Just given. She took a bite, chewed slowly, swallowed. Round her, the other women were eating too. Some crying, some silent. All of them trying to understand what this meant. This breakfast on the day the world ended and began again. Lotte sat beside Marlene, holding her coffee cup with both hands, staring into the dark liquid. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why are they still kind to us?" Marlene had spent 3 weeks asking herself the same question. 3 weeks watching, analyzing, looking for the trap, looking for the angle. But there was no trap, no angle, just food, day after day after day. "I don't know," Marlene said finally. "Maybe because they can afford to be." Lotta thought about that, took a sip of coffee. Or maybe she said softly, because they're not what we were told they were. Marlene said nothing, just ate her bread, felt the butter melt on her tongue, tasted something that might have been bitterness, or might have been the slow, painful dissolution of certainty. Because Lotta was right. The Americans weren't monsters, weren't the brutes from the propaganda posters, weren't the enemies she had been taught to hate. They were just men. Young men far from home, tired of war, doing their jobs, sharing their food because they had it and others didn't. And that truth was harder to bear than any punishment, harder than starvation or captivity or defeat, because it meant everything she had believed was wrong, everything she had worked for, everything she had justified and rationalized and convinced herself was necessary. All of it, wrong. She finished her breakfast in silence, washed her plate, walked back to the barracks. That night, she pulled out the bread she had been saving. 5 pieces now, wrapped carefully in cloth, hidden in her coat. She looked at them in the dim light, thought about her sister in Munich, about Lotte's mother in the Black Forest, about all the people outside the wire who were free but starving while she, a prisoner, ate 3 meals a day. She thought about Frank Walsh giving her extra bread, about him knowing she was hoarding and not reporting it, about him saying, "For your sister," like it was the most natural thing in the world to help your enemy feed her family. She wrapped the bread back up, put it away, lay down. And for the first time since April 15th, Marlene Fisher whispered words she thought she would never say. Words that felt like betrayal and truth at the same time. Der Krieg ist wirklich vorbei. The war is really over. Not because Germany had surrendered, not because the fighting had stopped, but because she had stopped hating, had stopped seeing the Americans as enemies and started seeing them as people who gave her bread. And that changed everything. May 15th, 1945, 7 days after victory, the morning began like all the others, the ring of the ladle, the smell of coffee, The line of women holding tin plates waiting for breakfast that had become as predictable as sunrise. But today was different. Today, at the end of the meal, an announcement came. The camp was being processed for release. Prisoners would be evaluated, documented, and returned to their homes over the next 2 weeks. Those with families to claim them would go first. Those with nowhere to go would be transferred to displaced persons camps until arrangements could be made. Freedom. The word should have brought joy, should have brought relief. Instead, it brought fear. Marlene Fisher stood in the compound listening to the announcement and felt her chest tighten. 7 days ago, she would have welcomed this news, would have counted the hours until she could leave this place and return to whatever remained of her life. But now, standing with a full stomach for the first time in years, the prospect of freedom felt like a threat. Out there beyond the wire, Munich was a ruin. Food was scarce. Order had collapsed. The black market ruled the streets, and a single loaf of bread cost more than most people earned in a month. In here, there were 3 meals a day, clean water, medical care, a mattress to sleep on. The paradox was complete and terrible. She was safer as a prisoner than she would be as a free woman. That afternoon, names were called. Lotte Schneider was on the list. Her mother had sent confirmation through the Red Cross that she could return home to the Black Forest. A truck would take her tomorrow morning. Lotte should have been happy, should have been celebrating. Instead, she sat on her mattress in the barracks with her head in her hands. Marlene sat beside her. "What's wrong?" Lotte looked up. Her eyes were red. "I don't want to go." "Don't be stupid," Marlene said. "You're free. You can go home." Home to what, Lotte asked. To a burned village, to fields that can't be planted because there's no seed, to a mother who's eating grass to survive. She gestured toward the window, toward the compound where the serving table stood. "Here I eat 3 times a day. Here I'm safe. Here there are people who care if I'm hungry." Her voice broke on the last word. Marlene said nothing because Lotte was right. Freedom meant returning to a Germany that was broken and starving. Freedom meant leaving the one place where food was guaranteed. That evening, Marlene watched Lotte pack her few belongings, a change of clothes, a blanket, the wrappers from 3 Hershey bars that James Mitchell had given her, folded carefully and tucked into her pocket like love letters. Before lights out, Lotte walked across the compound to the guards' quarters. She asked to speak to Private Mitchell. He came out surprised, concerned, thinking something was wrong. Lotte held out her hand. In it were 2 pieces of chocolate she had been saving. Her last 2 pieces. "I wanted to give you something," she said in broken English. "To say thank you for the kindness." James looked at the chocolate, looked at this 19-year-old girl offering him back the gift he had given her, the only thing she had of value in the entire world. He shook his head. "No, you keep it, for the journey home." But Lotte pressed the chocolate into his hand. "Please, I want you to have something to remember. That we were not all bad. That some of us were just people." James's throat tightened. He took the chocolate, not because he wanted it, but because refusing would have hurt her. "I'll remember," he said quietly. "I promise." Lotte nodded, turned to go, then stopped. Looked back. "Do you think," she asked, voice small, "that things will get better?" Outside, James wanted to lie, wanted to tell her everything would be fine. But he had seen the reports, had heard the officers talking. Germany was devastated. Recovery would take years, maybe decades. "I think," he said carefully, "that it will be hard. But I think you'll survive. You're stronger than you know." Lotte smiled, a small, sad smile. "I learned that here, in this place, being fed by people I was supposed to hate." She left before James could respond, walked back to the barracks, back to Marlene. That night, Marlene lay awake listening to Lotte breathe. Tomorrow the girl would be gone, would climb into a truck and disappear into the chaos of post-war Germany, and Marlene would stay here, waiting for her own name to be called, waiting for her own turn to leave safety and return to ruin. She thought about the bread in her coat pocket, 6 pieces now, saved over weeks. She had planned to send them to her sister, but maybe she should give them to Lotte instead, for the journey, for the uncertain days ahead. She pulled out the bread, looked at it in the darkness, then made a decision. She walked to Lotte's mattress, knelt down, tucked the bread into the girl's bag. Lotte stirred, opened her eyes. "Marlene, for your mother." Marlene whispered. It's not much, but it's something. Lotta sat up, saw the bread, her eyes filled with tears. I can't take your food. You can, Marlene said. You will. Your mother needs it more than my sister does. Munich has the black market. Your village has nothing. Lotta threw her arms around Marlene, hugged her tight. The older woman stiffened, unused to affection, unused to touch. But then slowly she raised her hands and hugged back. Thank you, Lotte whispered. Thank you. They stayed like that for a moment. Two German women in an American prison camp holding each other in the dark, sharing the only thing they had left, hope. The next morning Lotte had left. Marlene watched from the barracks window as the truck pulled away, watched until it disappeared down the road, watched until there was nothing left to see. Then she turned away, walked to the mess line, got her breakfast, ate alone. May 20th. The camp was emptying. Every day more names called, more women leaving. The barracks that had held 60 now held 40, then 30, then 20. Marlene's name had not been called. Her sister had not sent confirmation, had not responded to the Red Cross inquiry. Marlene told herself it was because the postal system was destroyed, because Munich was in chaos, because her sister was probably fine, just unreachable. But at night she wondered, worried, imagined her sister dead in the rubble, imagined her starved, imagined all the terrible things that could happen to a woman alone in a defeated city. The bread she had given, i.e., Lotte, had been meant for her sister, and now it was gone and her sister might be dying, and Marlene had nothing left to send. The guilt ate at her, but so did something else, something harder to name. Relief, because as long as she stayed here, she didn't have to face what was outside, didn't have to see the ruins, didn't have to confront the reality of what the Reich had become. Here in this camp, with its 3 meals a day and its American guards, she could pretend the world had not ended, could pretend there was still order and structure and certainty. May 25th. Frank Walsh received his orders. His unit was being rotated out, sent back to the States for demobilization. After 18 months in Europe, he was going home. He should have been celebrating, should have been counting the hours. But instead, he stood at the serving table during breakfast and felt something like regret. There were only 80 women left in the camp now. He knew most of them by sight, knew their habits, knew who liked extra butter and who saved bread and who always said thank you in careful English. He knew Marlene Fisher, the blonde woman who had been so hard and cold those first weeks, who had softened gradually like ice in spring sun, who still ate alone but no longer looked at him with hatred. She came through the line that morning, took her plate, then stopped. I heard you're leaving, she said in English. Her accent was thick but understandable. Frank nodded. End of the week, going home. Marlene looked down at her plate, then back at him. I wanted to say something. Before you go, Frank waited. Thank you, she said, for the food, for the kindness, for not treating us like animals. We're just following orders, Frank said automatically. Geneva Convention. Marlene shook her head. No, it was more than that. You gave me extra bread. You pretended not to see when I saved food. You spoke to me like I was a person. That was not orders. That was choice. Frank felt his throat tighten. Yeah, I guess it was. Why, Marlene asked. Why did you choose to be kind? Frank thought about his answer, thought about his father during the Dust Bowl, thought about watching his mother cry over empty flour jars, thought about everything he had seen in this war that had taught him the difference between necessary cruelty and unnecessary kindness. Because I could, he said finally, because I had food and you were hungry, because at the end of the day, you are just a person, same as me, and persons need to eat. Marlene's eyes shone with something that might have been tears, but she blinked them back, nodded. I worked for Goebbels, she said quietly. In Munich, I typed propaganda, lies about Americans, about you. I told my country you were monsters who would destroy us. Frank said nothing, just listened. I was wrong, Marlene continued. You defeated us. You could have starved us, could have humiliated us, could have taken revenge for everything we did. But instead, you gave us breakfast. She paused, swallowed hard. I don't know if that makes you good or us evil, or if the world is just more complicated than I was taught. But I know this. You showed me that enemies can be human, and that matters. That will always matter. Frank held out his hand. Marlene looked at it, then took it. They shook. Former enemies, former captor and captive. Now just two people saying goodbye. Good luck out there, Frank said. I hope your sister is safe. I hope your family is proud, Marlene replied. They should be. Frank released her hand, watched her walk away with her breakfast, watched her sit on the bench where she always sat, watched her eat slowly, carefully, making it last. That night, he wrote his final journal entry from Germany, May 25th, 1945. Tomorrow I leave this place, leave these women, leave this strange job of feeding people who were supposed to be my enemies. I don't know what happens to them next. Don't know if they'll survive what's coming. But I know this. I saw a woman who hated me learn not to hate. I saw hunger turn to hope. I saw what happens when you choose mercy over vengeance. And I think that's what victory should look like. Not parades and medals, just people eating breakfast. Just enemies becoming human again. One meal at a time. He closed the notebook, packed it in his duffel. Tomorrow he would go home to Iowa, would help his father plant wheat, would try to forget the war. But he knew he would never forget the sound of the ladle ringing against the pot, or the smell of coffee in the morning, or the sight of 300 women learning to trust again. June 1st, 1945. Marlene Fisher's name was finally called. Her sister had been found, had sent word through the Red Cross, was alive, was waiting in Munich. Marlene should have felt relief, should have felt joy. Instead, she felt only fear. She packed her belongings, a spare dress, a blanket, the letters from her sister, and in her pocket, hidden carefully, one last piece of bread. Not from her own saving. This had been pressed into her hand by another prisoner that morning, a gift. Pay it forward, the woman had said. Before she left, Marlene walked to the empty serving area. The soldiers were gone. Frank Walsh and his unit had shipped out 3 days ago. New guards had taken their place. Younger men who didn't know the routines, who served food efficiently, but without recognition, without the small kindnesses. Marlene stood where she had stood every morning for 6 weeks, remembered the first breakfast, the shock of it, the taste of butter, the way she had cried without meaning to. This is the best food I've ever had. She had said it in German, hadn't known Frank could understand, but he had heard anyway, had understood in the way that mattered. A truck honked. Time to go. Marlene climbed in with 5 other women, the last group to leave. The truck pulled out of the compound, through the gates, onto the road that led away from the Rhine and toward whatever remained of Germany. As they drove, Marlene looked back, saw the barbed wire growing smaller, saw the compound fading into the distance, saw the place where she had been fed by her enemies, and learned that the world was not what she thought it was. 1 year later, June 1946, Marlene Fisher sat at a small table in a reconstructed office building in Munich. Around her, the city was slowly rebuilding, brick by brick, street by street. The Marshall Plan had begun. American aid was flowing in. Food, medicine, building materials. The irony was not lost on her. Once again, Americans were feeding Germans. Once again, the defeated were being sustained by the victors. She pulled out a piece of paper, a pen, began to write. Dear Sergeant Walsh, she paused, wondered if this letter would ever reach him. Wondered if he would remember her, one blonde woman among hundreds of prisoners, one face in the endless crowd of the defeated. But she wrote anyway. I don't know if you'll receive this. The Red Cross promised to try to forward it, but the world is still broken and mail is uncertain. But I needed to write, needed to say things I couldn't say in the camp. My sister is alive, thin but alive. We are living together in what remains of Munich. The apartment is damaged, but it has a roof. We have ration cards from the American occupation government. We have food, not much but enough. I gave her the bread you gave me, the extra slice you put on my plate that day when you knew I was saving food. She cried when she ate it, said it was the best thing she'd tasted in 2 years. I told her it came from an American sergeant who could have punished me but chose kindness instead. She asked me if all Americans were like you. I said I didn't know, but I hope so. Marlene stopped writing, stared at the words, then continued. I spent 3 years working for the propaganda ministry. I typed lies. I helped spread hatred. I convinced people that You were monsters. And then you fed me breakfast. I don't expect forgiveness. Don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that what you did mattered. You changed how one German woman sees the world. And maybe that's not much. Maybe it doesn't make up for anything. But it's something. I teach now. History. To children who are trying to understand what happened to their country. I tell them about the camp, about the American soldiers who gave us food when they could have given us nothing, about how enemies can become humans if we let them. Some of the children don't believe me. They say Americans must have had ulterior motives, must have wanted something in return. I tell them no. Sometimes people are kind because they can afford to be, because they have enough to share, because they choose mercy over cruelty. I tell them about you, about the sergeant from Iowa who spoke broken German and gave extra bread to prisoners and made me realize that hate is exhausting and pointless, and that the world is saved by small acts repeated daily. Thank you, Sergeant Walsh, for the breakfast, for the kindness, for teaching me that humanity survives even in the worst of times. With gratitude, Marlene Fisher. She folded the letter, addressed it to Frank Walsh, Iowa, USA, gave it to the Red Cross, and hoped. 3 months later, in a farmhouse outside Des Moines, Frank Walsh received a thin envelope with German stamps. He opened it, read it again. Then he sat down at his own table and wrote back, "Dear Marlene, your letter found me. I'm back home now, working my father's farm, growing wheat, the same wheat that got turned into bread that fed you." Funny how that works. How something that starts in an Iowa field ends up in a prison camp in Germany. Ends up saving lives, ends up changing minds. I'm glad your sister is alive. Glad you're teaching. Glad something good came out of all that darkness. You asked if all Americans are like me. I don't know, we're just people. Some good, some bad, most somewhere in between. Same as Germans, I guess. Same as everyone. But I learned something too in that camp. I learned that the greatest weapon isn't the bomb or the gun. It's the choice to be decent when you don't have to be. It's the bread you share with your enemy. It's the refusal to let hate have the last word. You were never my enemy, Marlene. You were just a hungry woman who needed breakfast. And I was just a soldier with food to give. That's all it ever was. That's all it needed to be. Keep teaching those children. Tell them the truth. That people are complicated. That war makes us forget our humanity. But that humanity can come back. One meal at a time. Your friend Frank Walsh. The letters continued, back and forth over months, over years. Two people on opposite sides of the biggest war in history connected by the memory of breakfast served behind barbed wire. September 1975. 30 years after the war, Marlene Fisher, now 58 years old, stood in front of a classroom in Munich. Her hair was gray, her face lined, but her eyes were still sharp, still clear. In the back of the classroom sat a visitor. An American man in his 50s with graying hair and kind eyes. Frank Walsh had returned to Germany for the first time since the war, had come to see what had become of the country he had helped defeat and feed. Marlene was teaching a lesson on the occupation, on the Marshall Plan, on the choices America made after victory. One of the students raised a hand. "Herr Fisher, why did the Americans help us? We were the enemy. We started the war. Why didn't they punish us?" Marlene looked at Frank. He smiled, nodded. She turned back to the student. "Because she said they understood something we had forgotten. That hungry people need food more than they need ideology. That defeated people need hope more than they need humiliation. That the way you treat your enemy after you win says more about you than anything you did during the fight." She walked to her desk, picked up an old tin can. Spam, rusted, ancient, but preserved. This, she said, is from 1945, from a prison camp on the Rhine. An American soldier gave it to me. I never opened it. I kept it to remember. Remember what the student asked. "That enemies can become friends," Marlene said. "That bread is more powerful than bullets. That the best meal of my life was given to me by a man who had every reason to hate me. And that changed everything." After class, Marlene and Frank walked through the streets of Munich. The city had been rebuilt. Modern, prosperous, unrecognizable from the ruins of 1945. They stopped at a cafe, ordered coffee. "Do you ever regret it?" Marlene asked. Feeding us, being kind when you could have been cruel. Frank shook his head. Never, not once. Why not? Because I saw what kindness can do, Frank said. Saw it change you, change Lottie, change the way people saw each other. That's worth more than revenge. Marlene lifted her coffee cup. To breakfast then, to the best meal I ever had. Frank raised his own cup. To breakfast, and to everything it taught us, they drank. Two old friends, two former enemies, two people who had learned 30 years ago that humanity survives in the smallest acts, in the ring of a ladle, in the smell of coffee, in the choice to feed instead of starve, to build instead of destroy, to see people instead of enemies. Outside the city hummed with life. Children played in streets that had once been rubble. Shops sold food that had once been impossible luxuries. The world had moved on. The world had... But in that cafe over coffee, Marlene and Frank remembered barbed wire and breakfast, remembered hunger and hope, remembered the day when everything changed. April 15th, 1945. The smell of butter drifting through the wire, the taste of bread on a starving woman's tongue, the simple revolutionary act of kindness in the middle of war. This is the best food I've ever had, not because of the taste, not because of the calories, but because of what it meant, what it proved, what it promised, that even in the darkest times humanity endures, that even enemies can break bread together, that the greatest victories are not won on battlefields, but at breakfast tables. One meal at a time, one choice at a time, one act of mercy that echoes across decades. This is how the world is saved, not with grand gestures or sweeping proclamations, but with ladles and coffee pots and the stubborn refusal to let hate have the final word. This is how enemies become friends, how prisoners become teachers, how soldiers become farmers, how ruins become cities, how war becomes peace. One breakfast at a time, the best meal of a lifetime, given, received, remembered, and never forgotten.